Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'd like to talk to you this morning about some of the rethinking about the nature and purpose of media regulation in Jamaica that we're currently undertaking. If you look at this slide here, you see the array of regulatory options and approaches currently available. And as you can see, they're along a spectrum ranging from statutory regulation to self-regulation. There's a lot of self-regulatory pressures in the industry already, including concerns about possible damage to reputation or brand. But of course, in the more egregious cases, we have the option to make a statutory regulatory intervention. So this is where we are at the moment. We operate with a mix of regulatory instruments. Of course, we're also involved in education, educating the population in particular to understand the media and the way it's changing and its importance in their lives. We've been through a number of stages of the evolution of regulation and thinking about regulation. And it's possible to demarcate 5 separate stages. In the beginning, regulation was introduced largely to control the behavior of monopolies, which lacked market forces, lacked competitive pressure to make them do anything to reduce their prices or to improve their performance. Then, of course, we realized that that was actually, in some cases, leading to adverse outcomes, that regulators were sometimes putting companies under pressure to deliver certain technological outcomes. These were not necessarily the optimal technology. So in the second generation of regulation, there was a process of partial liberalization and the creation of more specialized, more technically informed regulatory bodies, and this idea of creating partnerships with industry to decide what was best practice and how it could be best disseminated across the entire sector. In the third wave, people started to realize that regulation was itself an important tool in terms of attracting inward investment, stimulating innovation, encouraging, allowing wider access, and encouraging competition, because regulation is such an important variable in terms of changing corporate behavior, and we realized it could be used to improve market conditions for everybody. In the fourth generation, we started to see regulation itself as part of a larger national program, moving towards national development, social inclusion, and so on. Where we are now is in terms of regulation that now spans a range of government agencies, looking to increase efficiency, economic efficiency, business efficiency, encourage more rapid innovation, dissemination of better technologies, sharing best practices, encouraging innovation, and trying to overcome the issues with interoperability, quality of service. We want to have a world in which we can share data and utilize data, but we have to find new ways now to ensure data privacy and security. The overarching goal is to enable the transition to a digital society and meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So some of the specific outcomes that we're now looking for is the transition to smart cities, cities in which the lives of the inhabitants are better because we have properly integrated energy, waste, transport, work systems. We have a world in which all our appliances are going to be interconnected so that we'll all be walking through a very, very rich data field, data which will be able to make our lives better, inform everyday decisions. Of course, in the next few years, we'll be seeing the introduction of things like driverless cars, planes and ships. A lot of our transport systems, a lot of our building management systems will all be now moving over to AI platforms. So again, we need to think about how this is going to affect the world of information exchange, communication, and media. We'll have a world in which we do a lot more to monitor the flows of information, energy, resources, and people, hopefully for benign purposes. And increasingly, we'll see a lot of what are now regarded as professional services, including things like medical services, legal, educational investment, translation, migrating, and increasingly we will see these being provided by artificial intelligence systems. This is going to change profoundly what we think of as the media, what we think of as news, and how we manage these information and communication flows in our lives. But we're also, unfortunately, seeing the emergence of a whole new generation of threats, some of which could potentially undermine this transition to a digital society. So we also have to think now about how we're going to identify, contain, and mitigate these threats. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've undergone a profound transition, and further changes lie ahead. There was a time in which you actually had discrete information channels, discrete media channels. They were called things like radio, television, telephone, print media. And the fact that the infrastructure dictated the channel meant that you had clear boundaries, and you had regulatory bodies which had separate roles according to the channel. This is no longer how it works. Now we have multiple independent channels, and we have unbundled services running across common networks. So what we've got is a situation where you can now get multiple services running over the same or competing networks using, in some cases, different technology platforms. So your news is coming to you through a wired network or a wireless network. All services, essentially, are now just simply data streams. Your voice, your video, your news feed, whatever, they're just now individual elements in a vast and mighty river, little streams within a river, all coming in your direction. So the old model of regulation, in which we could regulate by channel, is no longer operable. Essentially what we're trying to do is rethink what the nature and purpose of regulation is. We have found ourselves in a situation where we're trying to regulate just one little stream in a mighty river, and this no longer makes technical sense or any other kind of sense. A second challenge is that so many of the transactions that we are now charged with monitoring take place across borders. And of course, this raises major issues for many governments as to how these activities should be regulated, where the value is being added, how they should be taxed, and so on. It's perfectly possible now to provide news and media services in a country without any local presence or any local infrastructure. All you need is internet access, which means that that provider is now beyond your regulatory reach as currently defined. So do we need international accords? This is a major challenge for all media regulators around the world today. What's happening now has already had many consequences, some of which are good, but it also has incurred some costs. The first thing that's very clear is that the flow of content is no longer controlled by infrastructure. Infrastructure is become just a commodity, it's just a conduit. There are many conduits. Second, what we've seen is the emergence of widespread ability to bypass conventional delivery models and therefore bypass existing models of regulation. What we still think of as technology firms are actually now some of our biggest media providers. They've morphed into giant media providers. Social media is the news source, or a news source, for about 60% of all adults in the United States, and in fact it's the primary news source for about 20% of the market. What's happened, of course, is that the advertising revenue has migrated along with the people. The audience for conventional media is shrinking. It's down to perhaps just about 20% of the total market. Many of the traditional media firms have gone. In the world over the last 20 years, we've seen more small newspapers close than I think at a more rapid rate than at any time in history. And there are fewer journalists as a result. Many more bloggers and vloggers, and far fewer people who would resemble the traditional classical distinction of a professional journalist. So the media firms, the ones that still think of themselves as media firms, are now probably competing more with technology firms than they are with other media firms. And some of the new challenges, well, there's only about half a dozen companies in the world that control most social data. And it's going to be extremely difficult now for any new company to challenge those incumbents. So we've actually gone back almost into where we were with the first generation of regulation, which is now how do we manage these new monopolies. Many of these firms offer free services and products, but of course what they're harvesting is your data. And many people are actually voluntarily giving up much more data than they realize, including every single call they make, their consumer preferences, where they are geographically. And this information is enormously valuable. And of course, the technology firms are retailing this data. So you are actually paying, not in cash, but in other ways, for the free services, the free apps that you're downloading. One of the more troubling developments is the emergence and weaponization of fake news. We've now seen the very credible evidence that the last US presidential election was influenced by Russian involvement through the manipulation of social media. But this is not just the Russians who are doing it. We've actually got evidence that of widespread political manipulation of electoral and political outcomes in at least 30 countries around the world by disseminating false and slanted news through social media. And the problem with the fact that so many people now get their primary, see social media, use it as their primary news source, is that there is no authoritative news source there. There is no verification, there is no checking, there is no fact checking, and because the social media is actually built up around their personal preferences, they're only hearing from like-minded people. It's very easy to plant false information now into that closed network, into these echo chambers, and have it believed and have it acquire credibility because it's being retweeted. Cyberbullying is a major challenge now. There have been children, young people who have been induced to kill themselves because of the way that they are shamed through our cyberspace. Terrorist recruitment is another major challenge. Over the course of the year August 2016 to May 2017, fundamentalist organizations put up something like 54,000 websites with information including how to construct an improvised explosive device, and about 2/3 of the information put up was shared within 2 hours of posting. So it's no longer possible to deal with terrorism by border controls. These people are already inside the country and they are already talking to and recruiting disaffected youth and teaching them how to construct explosive devices. And in this country, in Jamaica, we have a major challenge with gangs. We have nearly 300 active gangs in this country who have taken to social media and they use it as another front in their war. And we have had people filming atrocities, rapes and homicides, and then posting this on social media to intimidate other gangs and to inflict further harm on the family of their victim. And this is not something that we can stand by and watch and deal with. We have to have mechanisms to deal with this. The conclusion of all of this is that our existing model of regulation is by now has been largely overtaken by events, and we need not just a new set of tools, we need a new approach, a new philosophy of regulation in this country. But it's a little bit like trying to regulate the river. We have a torrent of new possibilities now, which has been enabled by the fact that our lives are now taking place in this middle of this river of information. And much of this is enormously empowering and enormously liberating. And we want all of these good things to happen. But in there now, unfortunately, we also have evils, like, for example, fraud, cybercrime, which is now the world's most costly form of crime, costing the economies of the world an estimated $6 trillion a year. Fake news and the deliberate manipulation of political outcomes, abuse of privacy, bullying, child abuse and terrorism. So what we have to find now is a way of ensuring that the good things can happen and can continue unchecked, but we have to find ways of giving consumers protection in all of their transactions in this new cyber world, which means that we need a much more integrated approach to regulation in future. Now, part of this new philosophy is that we think that we have to indicate not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it. So we need to talk about the direction of travel, where it is we're trying to get to. Well, we believe very strongly that we are part of our mission is to enable Jamaica's transition into the digital society. We want to facilitate all of the positive things that we see happening, but we need to find ways to mitigate the harms. We want to have a situation where good media services are available to all citizens We want a media and technology literate society. We know that the demand now is for seamless access to diverse content across all platforms, so that is where we must try to get to. So what this means for regulation itself is that it must be much more streamlined than in the past. It must be effective but low cost, content focused and technology agnostic. The technology, the infrastructure is no longer the critical factor, and our model of regulation has to evolve accordingly. Weaknesses, well, we've got challenges in the media, amongst the media companies in this country today. Quality control is sometimes variable. Attitudes to intellectual property rights is not always as strong as it should be. Many of the media companies in this country are not profitable, and this is not good news for the health of the sector, so which means that their long-term viability is in doubt. And as I said a minute ago, we have criminal organised crime and gangs active on social media and taking advantage of it. So here's the challenges that we face today. First of all, our traditional media have got a shrinking market share, which means that they also now have a disproportionate share of regulatory obligations. We are probably just regulating 20 or 25% of the market. The rest of the people have migrated into unregulated space. What this means is that if we just ratchet up the pressure, the regulatory pressure on the survivors, all we're doing is we're going to accelerate the transition into unregulated space. This makes no sense at all. We've got 49 cable operators in this country, which is a lot for a relatively small country. But most of them are not making money. There's maybe 4 or 5 of them making money, and the rest are at best marking time. Some of them are not providing good service, and some of them are not in compliance with the regulatory requirements. So this is clearly not a desirable situation. We have 243 zones, media zones in this country. This is really a historical anomaly. It happened because it was set up in a rush over a decade ago, and this is really far too many zones. One of the things that we therefore have to do is now rationalize the situation, because we have companies, we have areas in this country, we have small communities which cannot be reached economically. In other words, it's impossible to run a profitable cable service running service to these very small and isolated communities. But in many cases, this is simply because they're in the wrong zone. And if we merge the zones into larger, economically viable units, we can probably go a far way to making sure that everybody, the entire population, get access to reasonable quality services. But we have great strengths too. And one of the greatest strengths of this country is that we do have a free and strong media. And this is absolutely essential. It's a foundation stone of democracy. So these are the sorts of things that we're engaged with right now. We need to find ways to reduce the cost and the burden of compliance, because we want to make the playing field a little more level. We want to encourage the media firms to invest in upgrading their skills and technologies. Now, in many cases, what we would like to do is encourage them to think of mergers and acquisitions. We think the country would be much better served with a smaller number of larger companies with stronger technical capability and better and stronger management. We think that this would take us a long way to making sure that the whole population had access to good quality media services. Part of that is we're going to go into this rezoning exercise. We're going to end up with fewer zones, and they will be more geographically sensible and economically viable than the ones we have now. We're going to introduce a multi-tariff system. Now, at the moment, we just have a one-size-fits-all tariff. In fact, some of the smaller companies haven't even been paying the fees that they're due. We're going to offer them a one-off transitional arrangement where they will be zero rated. In other words, they will not pay their fees. But this is not a free lunch. They have to demonstrate to us that they are reinvesting that money back into their technologies, so that at the end of the 3 years, they will either be better equipped and delivering better service than they are now, or they will be more attractive targets for mergers and acquisitions. This is just another way that we are going to encourage the emergence of a smaller number of larger, stronger media companies in this country. Now, of course, much social media is not regulated at all at the moment. What this means is that we're going to double and redouble our efforts on media literacy. so that people understand the power and also the pitfalls of social media, of putting private information available out there, and also of the extent to which you can now be manipulated through fake news. We're going to be working with the Ministry of Education, going into all the schools, making sure that all the children know this, because this is their world, this is the world that they are going into. We're going to have much more interagency cooperation on this, and we've already reached out to companies like Facebook, asking them to work with us on this. And we don't just want to be bad guys, you know, the tough guys, beating up on the media all the time. We actually think there's an incredibly important role for good quality investigative journalism in particular. So we want to introduce the idea of an award scheme for some of the best journalism that's going on in this country today. We think it should get the recognition that it deserves. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.